Welcome everyone. Just let the attendees flood in. Before we get started. Amazing. Well, good morning everyone and welcome to this Sustain webinar on communicating the climate and nature emergency so it matters to everyone. This is hosted by Sustain, the Alliance for Food and Farming, for Better Food and Farming. And my name is Cecily Spelling and I'm coordinator at Sustain. Instead of being in our office today in London, I am tucked up in my house in Essex with a nice blanket on my lap, which I may not have had if I was in the office. And I hope wherever you are warm and well today. So yeah, we've got quite the lineup for you today, but before I hand over to our expert panelists, I just wanted to do some Zoom housekeeping. I know we've all spent pretty much the last year on Zoom, so we're well aware of the housekeeping rules, but just in case there are some lucky folk that haven't been on Zoom for the past year, I thought it's best to recap. So this is a Zoom webinar where we'll only have the panelists and myself visible to attendees, so there's no need to worry about being muted if you're an attendee. There is a chat box and Q&A box to encourage conversation though, so just because you're muted doesn't mean you can't be involved in the discussion. We welcome that. So we have the Q&A box for questions. Please put your questions in here because other attendees can use a clever tool to vote them up so they can get raised to the top of the profile, top of the pile. And the higher up the pile, the more likely it is that they'll be answered by the panel. So the Q&A box really is your friend there if you want to have your question answered. The chat box is for general chat. So in the absence of networking and the old after event drinks, which we probably all miss, we do encourage you to use the chat box as much as possible to kind of share your name, your organisation, where you're joining from, as well as projects that you're working on that are relevant or discuss points raised by the panelists and generally chatter away. It can be a fun space, so please do make the most of it. I must add that questions in the chat box won't be answered, so please do put them in the Q&A. As this is a virtual event, in case of any technical difficulties, please do flag these in the chat box and we'll try to fix any issues caused behind the scenes. So if, for example, you can't hear me or someone breaks up, do just let us know and we'll do our best to resolve that. And finally, this webinar is recorded. So we just had to check that it is recording. There's always that panic. So we will be sharing this on the website and making sure that we send it to you all so you can watch back or share it with anyone that you think might find it useful. So that's enough housekeeping for now. I'll just move into a brief introduction to Sustain and who we are. We are a charity focused on food and farming. Together, we advocate food and agriculture policies and practices that enhance the health and welfare of people and animals, improve the working and living environment, enrich society and culture, and promote equity. We are an alliance, so we represent around 100 national and public interest organisations, locally, regionally and nationally, and we have about 30 members of staff, but we cover a very wide remit. Some projects and campaigns include the Children's Food Campaign, Sustainable Food Places, Capital Growth, and the Real Bread Campaign, to name but a very small few. We also coordinate a group of organisations that have received funding from the National Lottery Community Fund that work on food around the UK. This forum aims to strengthen the sector and improve connections, partly through workshops with forum members and through wider learning and sharing with the Alliance and the broader world. So following each workshop with the forum, we host a webinar to share the learning that's come out of different workshops and continue that conversation. And this is how we've come to be here today. So thanks very much to the lottery for making this happen. As you all know, the focus for today's session is how we communicate the climate and nature emergency so it matters to everyone. This session builds on the discussions the Food Learning Forum has had to date, but is a separate event with new speakers from outside the network and questions, so we're all hearing it for the first time. And before we kick off, I'm keen to understand how attendees currently feel about communicating climate change and the nature emergency with their peers and with their networks. Is it your bread and butter, or do you run a mile as soon as the topic comes up? We'll ask this question before the session and also after, so we can see if anything shared today has been useful. I'm really hoping I'm not setting myself up for a big fall there, but you don't know if you don't try. So bear with me while I just launch the poll. I'm using the Zoom poll for this question, so if you can all click at the bottom of your screen, you will see between the Q&A and the chat, there's polls. So there's a question there which you can all answer, and I'll just give you a minute to do that. The question is, how confident do you feel about communicating the climate and nature emergency to your peers and networks? And the options are: have no idea where to begin, okay, but could do more, you're happy communicating it, it's what you do best, or none of the above. So yeah, I'll just give you a little more time to answer that, and then I'll share the results so we can all see where people are at. I've got 90% of people have voted. If we can get that to 95, I'll be a happy lady. Oh, okay, I'll end the polling there and share the results with you so you can all see that too now. So it seems like the main one is okay, but could do more. So hopefully this webinar might provide you with some ideas on what more can be done, or some nice angles to use, or some further research that's needed, and just point you in the general direction of how to improve things. But it is an interesting topic. It's a big topic. It can be quite daunting to know where to begin. So hopefully we can work through some of that in today's session. So without further ado, you didn't come here for polls, you came here for panelists. So we've got 4 great ones for you today. We've got Tom Crompton from the Common Cause Foundation. We've got Judy Ling Wong from the Black Environment Network. We have Ellis Howard, a writer, actor and activist, and Ben Reynolds from Sustain. So each speaker will answer the same initial question, followed by a bit of discussion amongst themselves that we'll obviously listen to, and then a Q&A. So as we all know, well, without further ado, as we all know, that the climate and nature emergency will impact every aspect of life, and this is especially true for our food system. From changes to our food supply, to inequalities, to accessing food, the communities we work with will be affected. But with so many other priorities out there, how can we engage climate? How can we bring people on board to the climate movement and make the climate and nature emergency matter to everyone? And how can we do this by communicating the climate and nature emergency so it matters to everyone? So I need to stop saying without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom Crompton to start us off. Tom, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Cecily. Hello, everyone. Cecily, please will you intervene if my voice drops out? It's because the kids will be streaming homework somewhere and our bandwidth in Mid Wales isn't very wide. So please let me know if my voice starts to break up. So I wanted to start really by inviting us to situate communications on climate change or the nature emergency on a broader canvas. And I wanted to try to draw an arc, if you like, for how I see some of those communication approaches having evolved over the course of the last 20 years or so, since I started out as a campaigner for an environmental NGO. And back then it was thought, I think, the kind of the received wisdom was all we need to do is convey the facts. If only people were in possession of the sheer scale of the challenge that confronts us and knew the facts about that, then we'd be galvanized into mass action. And over the course of the time since then, I think clearly there's been growing awareness that whilst it's crucially important to convey the facts, conveying the facts alone isn't going to be sufficient. That's a perspective which is rooted in a robust body of social science research, but it's also, of course, been popularized by people like George Lakoff. You remember, who famously said, I'm going to paraphrase it perhaps, but something along the lines of, if the facts don't fit the frames, then the facts bounce off. You stick to your frames or your values, and if the facts are inconvenient, you're more likely to reject the facts and change your worldview. So that growing recognition of the limitations of where a focus on facts gets us led to, I think, a strengthening interest and a proper interest in narrative and frames, in the stories we tell ourselves. And now I think across the environment movement, there's this growing interest and commitment to thinking about the narratives we tell, the frames we use, and how they will resonate and land with different audiences. And I think that's crucially important work. Indeed, I've spent a lot of my time over the last 10 years or so advocating that we begin to think more in that way. But I want to suggest, in continuing this arc, that there are limitations to that as well. And the limitations, I think, start at the point at which we begin to ask, why is it that some narratives or some stories don't seem to stick? It's almost as though in the course of thinking about and refining particular narratives, we're honing the seed and we're getting the genetic information in that seed perfectly right, but then we're casting it on soil which is infertile, which is stony or hasn't been tilled, and that narrative isn't flourishing into the shade-giving trees and plants that it might. So what does that metaphor actually mean? Well, I think I'll draw on Margaret Thatcher to illustrate it. So Margaret Thatcher was interviewed in 1981 on the second anniversary of her first election by the Sunday Times, and she said, economics of a method, the object is to change the heart and soul. I think a clear indication that somebody who was an intuitively adept politician understood that part of her role was to change the way we see ourselves and relate to one another, see ourselves in the context of our relationship to one another and the wider world. What might that mean for campaigning, communicating on a polycrisis? I think it means that we need to step back at times from the specifics of communicating on climate change or biodiversity loss and ask, what is it that creates and forms that wider context or fabric in which our shared concern for one another and the wider world is rooted? And this is what leads us to value. So I just want to, in closing, give you one example of what this might mean practically, a project that we ran recently in Greater Manchester. So we surveyed 1,200 Greater Mancunians and we asked them about what they valued in life and what they took, using a standard values questionnaire. What they told us was that overwhelmingly they valued friendship and community and equality and social justice and environmental protection. We then asked them to imagine a typical fellow Greater Mancunian and tell us what they thought that typical fellow citizen held to be important. What did they value in life? And respondents systematically underestimated the importance that their fellow citizens placed on each of those values: community, friendship, well-being, social justice, equality, environmental protection. So whilst, and it didn't seem that that's not a result that arose as a result of self-reporting bias, something we were able to control for. It seems genuinely that whilst we as individuals place considerable importance on those things, we tend to underestimate the importance of those values in others. And that was true right across demographics. It was true of men and women. It was true of rich and poor. It was true of Brexiteers and Remainers. It was true of people who self-identified as liberal or as conservative. Why does that gap matter? Well, we found that it predicted a lower concern about climate change, lower support for local authority action on climate change, lower opposition to the expansion of Manchester Airport, and lower support for the use of public money to retrofit homes to improve their energy efficiency. And there's some experimental evidence emerging now that actually closing this perception gap improves some of those outcome measures. So this is what I mean by the soil. In this case, the soil is our perception, or rather misperception, of one another, which it seems is crucially important in underpinning and motivating our expressions of social and environmental concern. What might be done about it? Well, one example of what we did with this was to work with a large museum in Manchester to begin to put together opportunities for their visitors to come together and explore with one another what they valued in life, initially through live conversations, which we facilitated, then we took it online. Now we're working with a cohort of 14 arts and cultural organisations across the city region specifically asking what might the role of arts and cultural organisations be in communicating this simple insight, this simple truth that actually most of us care more for one another and the wider world than we recognise. So at one level, what I've taken you through, I think, is centrifugal in the sense that 10 seconds. In one sense, okay, right. In one sense, it's centrifugal in the sense that it's taken us beyond the specifics of campaigning on biodiversity loss or climate change. On the other hand, I think there's a real opportunity in this, which is the opportunity to begin to work with organizations and people who may not see themselves as having a formal role to communicate on climate change or biodiversity loss, but nonetheless, who in the course of engaging their various audiences can begin to work in ways that convey that simple insight, that simple truth, that most of us care more for one another and the wider world than we recognize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. So interesting, and no doubt people have got a lot of questions about that. And there is a whole website with loads of interesting reports and resources on the Common Cause website, so do take a look at that. Judy, over to you next.
Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking about two aspects in the context of racial justice. Firstly, building resilience and adaptation. And secondly, the amplification of minority voices for climate change action. The health vulnerability of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities is now common knowledge to all of us through the experience of COVID-19. We need to take action to counter the poorer health and well-being of minority communities set within the climate change agenda of adaptation and resilience. Obvious actions, as most minorities are urban people, include increasing local access to green spaces for contact with nature, reducing air pollution resulting from emissions, increasing access to affordable and better quality food, and improving living conditions and aspects of the local environment. Food is perceived as part of nature, and food growing is a particularly physically and culturally nourishing activity for ethnic minority communities. Actions for engagement has to be practical and relevant. For example, supporting the urban food growing movement, including as enterprises. But at the same time, allotments can be seen as target locations for engagement to increase representative voices, both in terms of having up-to-the-minute information to communicate climate action to peers and networks, and influencing decision makers. People growing food for themselves are already in touch with what affects a harvest, from the quality of the soil, the availability of water, to our increasingly unstable weather patterns. Here is a great opportunity to communicate a range of actions around food systems and build support for the elevation of minority voices for change. On the front of taking action, BAME communities, given the right visibility, resources, and support, are positioned to play a much greater role as voices for climate change action. Research for The Commitment, a project by the charity Carplaw Horizons, has highlighted that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups have a greater level of participation in climate change activities and a stronger belief in government action. Why this is so is very obvious to me. The people we call ethnic minorities within the UK are the ethnic majorities of the world. White people are only 11% of the world population. We are local and global people. All of us have links through family, friends, and colleagues to our countries of heritage across the world, and we are in touch with their greater vulnerability to climate change. Through these direct and emotionally powerful links, we are already more aware in general than the population as a whole about the local and global impact of climate change. We need the media and the environmental sector as a whole to recognize that the image that ethnic minority communities are not participating as much in climate change, it is out of date. Just because many of our actions are set within our personal lives and our communities, and we are 14% of the UK population, it does not mean we are not active. We are positioned to be a greater force as voices for climate change actions. The Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted the need for structural evolution to make inclusion a reality through action around the theme of representation and presence within decision-making structures. As a result of the work of organizations like Black Environment Network over some 30 years now, there's now a rising generation of ethnic minority activists. These activists need more visibility, more resources and support to become a cohesively powerful voice. A recent significant project is the Dog Society's Climate Reframe Database, an open database project highlighting 100 minority activists with their emails made public so that the media, conference, and event organizers may find them, work with them, and increase their visibility. Another good example is the Western Communicating Climate program, just launched by the Media Trust, offering free media training to increase the impact of voices for climate action. Look at the chat for the links. Such programs can make a real difference to the perception and the reality of ethnic minority participation as voices for climate action and climate justice. I look forward to more. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was amazing. Lots of food for thought and already lots of questions coming in. So thank you. Just a reminder that any questions should go in the Q&A. So if they're popping up as the panelists are speaking, please just work them in the Q&A and we'll get to them in that session. Next up, we have Ellis. Hello, Ellis.
Hey, hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Ellis. I'm an actor writer, as you can tell by the glorious whiteboard and post-it notes in the back. I'm going to be focusing on how we can arrest and engage young people and working class people, both of which I am. But I want to preface my whole talk with saying, whilst we're here to communicate the climate crisis to individual people, what is much more important is that we communicate it to governments and massive industries, which are a lot more damaging to the environment than focusing on my mum who can barely afford rent each month. But however, I am going to be breaking it down into 3 sections, which is affordability, availability, and then really focusing in on desirability. So in preparing for this, I read so many think pieces from The Guardian, Huffington Post, Medium, insert any sort of left-leaning establishment here, and a couple of right-wing ones too. And a lot of the narrative around climate change is just completely unavailable to a working class person or a person on a breadline. So for example, rejecting plastic for reusable beeswax wraps, milk in glass bottles or milk alternatives like oat milk, almond, coconut water, or organic in-season vegetables, protesting, taking time off work to go and protest with Extinction Rebellion or someone like that, saving energy or don't fly or being vegan. Lots of these things are strictly just unavailable for the average working class person. My mum saves energy, she has to, not for the environment, but for her purse. My mum doesn't fly that much, and if someone in my street needs to go to a food bank, it's very difficult to try and liaise with someone to say, oh hi, my food hamper, can it be vegan this week or this month? And how do you speak to someone and encourage someone to be vegan if for even generations they've been meat deprived? It's quite a difficult task, and it often leaves working class people feeling disempowered, disengaged and disenfranchised from the climate movement. So not only are these things not available, my local corner shop doesn't have organic produce, but if they are available, they're expensive. Oat milk, Oatly, for example, is small. It does about 6 cups of tea in our house, and it's very, very expensive. And so lots of the solutions that are already being touted or in the mainstream media are designed in such a way that lots of working class people are outside of that frame. So I would implore anyone who's watching this just to make sure that those solutions that are already being spouted by you, by your company, by whatever, are available and affordable. Ways we can do this are, so for example, look at Octopus or Bulb, 2 places which look at renewable energy. Do they promote in working class communities? do they heck? Because it's not sustainable. It is much more expensive, and there's no way someone in Pity Road and not a screen in Liverpool is going to go and look for a more expensive energy tariff. You know, so we need to look at how we can subsidize and legislate these type of things so they become available and affordable to working class folk. Okay, that's that done. So you've got a solution which is available and affordable. So how do we make working class people and young people want, care, and basically how do we make it desirable for them? So the way we do that is we make it accessible, we make it immediate, we make it fashionable, and we make it positive. Okay, so accessibility. Lots of these reports on like The Guardian, they are wrapped up in massive amounts of jargon, and it's important, but we need to look at ways that we can trim down the climate messaging so it's accessible. Look at amazing Instagram accounts like Chicks for Fashion, or for example, a friend of mine, Fainty Ballalung, who is a performer, who used a very simple piece of messaging, which is, take your right hand, put it on your chest, feel a human underneath that. That human operates at a temperature between 36.5 degrees and 37.5 degrees. Anything below that is hypothermia, and anything above that is fever. Now, since 1880, since the Industrial Revolution, the world has been in a constant, it's went up by 1.1 degrees, and that is like the world being in a constant fever pitch. So I explained this to my mum, and she went, oh, it's like the world is constantly in menopause. And I was like, absolutely, that is exactly what the climate emergency is like, Mum. And now suddenly it's accessible. Now she understands. I'm not saying she's an activist yet, but she's getting there, you know. So it's about making it accessible, making it immediate. So in terms of immediacy, I think of things like Ecosia, the search engine which plants trees. Every time I go Google or I go and stalk I don't know, Twitter celebrity I fancy that day, I'm planting trees. And in the top right corner, I can see my impact. Or the incredibly accessible interface of things like Ecology, where I pay £3.50 a month and I plant trees every single month. As a working class person, my life is the time scale of my life, the way I think about things, is the complete antithesis of the climate emergency. The climate emergency is slow, it's subtle. If you walk into an A&E department and you've got a grazed hand that could be infected in 10 years, you will not be seen as quickly as someone who's had their arm chopped off. You know, that's the way we need to think about the climate emergency. So making things that are immediate is much more likely to grab a working class person's attention, get them engaged, get them arrested. Okay, the third thing is fashionable. I care about the climate crisis. I'm part of Extinction Rebellion. Will I go and dress in a toga? Will I go and dress in a little toga, sing sea shanties and die outside Euston Station? Absolutely not. It's not fashionable. It's not cool. I care about my life. But these things, they need to be exciting. I want a world in which I want to live there. Look at K-pop stans, look at TikTokers, look at the incredible things that Redditors are doing right now with Wall Street. You know, things that are so cool and fashionable. TikTok people going and booking out all of Donald Trump's rally, and then so he turns up to an audience that no one is there. That's exciting. That's cool. Young people want to get involved. That is not middle class women dancing in the street with Extinction Rebellion. I love them, but it's not for me. It's not fashionable. We need to look at ways that are cool for young people to get involved in. Another example is Michaela Cole. Michaela Cole, if you haven't watched it, go watch I May Destroy You on BBC iPlayer. It's fucking great. But what does she do? The first thing that she does afterwards, she cares about global warming. So she gets offers from Chanel, Gucci, all of these places to be a fashion face for it. She says, no, I'm going to be a fashion face for Oxfam and make renewable clothing look really, really chic. Yes, you can argue working class people have been doing that for years, and yes, they have. But what we need to look at is, oh, great, is working with these influencers, working with these media personalities and targeting niche, fashionable things that is going to inspire the next generation of young activists. Okay, finally, positive. How am I doing, Cicely? Am I okay, timing-wise? Okay, fab. The final thing is positivity. I am terrified by the climate crisis. I go to sleep crying every single night knowing that water is now being traded on the stock market. I think, will I ever have kids? I'm gay and I probably couldn't afford them in IVF anyway if I did want them. But what I want is, so every single movement has a prevailing mood to it. Okay, so the punk movement, the prevailing mood is anger. The LGBTQ plus movement, me, is pride. And the prevailing mood in the climate emergency is panic. Greta Thunberg literally looks at a bunch of like disheveled old men and says, I want you to panic. Now, what I'm here to say is, yes, absolutely panic, but in our messaging, in our campaigns, they also need to be surrounded with hope too. I'm not, and you can panic and have hope in exactly the same way that I'm saying that we need both wind and solar energy if we're going to combat these two things. They're in harmony, they're not mutually exclusive. And I want to talk about a woman called Eve Tuck who wrote Letters to a Community. If you haven't seen it, please read it. So Water Aid completely changed the way that they frame their political messaging, their campaign videos. And they did a thing called Sunshine After a Rainy Day. And instead, it really empowered this young girl called Claudia in Zambia. And it showed what her community was like after they had rainfall. And what it showed was a really positive, really autonomous community. And it went absolutely against the usual messaging of these are these people in Zambia. They are completely dispossessed. They're completely in a broken system. It empowered them. What did it do? It won lots of awards and also gave record amount of donations to Water Aid. So what we can do in our messaging is inspire hope. I want to finish off and saying two things that have inspired massive amounts of hope that have been super successful very recently. I'm very interested by the way that Tom started with Margaret Thatcher. And here I am about to talk about Brexit and Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, make America great again. Boris Johnson, bring back control, or I think it is bring back control. Both of these things go from a dystopian past and give the idea of a utopian future. And where were they massively successful? They were massively successful for working class communities, in activating them, getting them to go out and vote. So how can we take those models, both things I obviously completely disagree with, how can we take the framework of that? How can we, in our messaging to young people, to working class people, how can we say, yes, it's bad, but we've got to have hope? How can we make it cool, accessible, positive, and very, very fashionable? And I think if we do that, we can inspire a whole nother generation of working class people and young people. I yield my time, Cicely.
That's fine. My role is to chair, but I was too engaged to stop you. So thanks so much, Ellis. You're getting a lot of love in the chat box. Lots of questions about how we can actually, do what you're saying and make it cool. So I'm sure we'll get to that in the Q&A session. But I want to get to Ben now. So Ben, you're up.
Thank you, Cecily. I'm Ben Reynolds, Deputy Chief Exec at Sustain. I suppose I wanted to return to the first question, the question of the webinar. How can we communicate the climate and nature emergency in a way that matters to everyone? So I'm going to ask how we can communicate the climate and nature emergency and the role of food and farming in a way that matters to everyone. And more specifically, how we can communicate it in a way that matters to economists and those who are economically focused. Before I get on to how, I want to ask why we need to do that. So you've got the idea. I'm going to be focusing on food, farming, the economy. So food and farming has until recently been overlooked in climate discussions as the climate movement has translated its values to apply to the economy through things like the Green New Deal, green recovery, or the wider Build Back Better narrative. But food and farming hasn't featured. As Fatima's quote, I suppose, encapsulates, this was from Sustain's annual conference on food and farming and the green recovery before Christmas. And I think that's a need for the food and farming movement to better engage with Green New Deal and to make the case, and also to sell ourselves in terms that really resonate with those who are pushing the idea of a green economic recovery or building back better. So from fishing to food factories, from barns to bars, food and farming is the UK's largest employer, with 4.1 million people working in this sector in 2018. Or put a different way, it's 1 in 7 of the UK's workforce. It has the biggest manufacturing sector, so I think it's 121 billion, with food exports valued above 23 billion. At least it was before Christmas. So when we talk about the environmental impact and the health impact of food, the social impact of food, it's the food economy on the whole that we're talking about. So how do we shift our food economy? We can look at the policies and investment that underpin the current economic model and question those. And we can look at ways to improve the sustainability of the mainstream model. And this is part of what Sustain and our Alliance members do. The other part is also looking at those alternatives. So this isn't just about choosing organic in the supermarket. This isn't just about consumer action, but this is the point that Ellis was making at the start. How do we shift government? How do we shift business? How do we shift those supply chains? So we need to shift investment away from the damaging practices, the less sustainable businesses, the unhealthier products, to those models that are inherently more sustainable. So if we want to convince investors, if we want to convince government to invest in those more climate and nature friendly food and farming enterprises and business models, we need to challenge the economic terms on which these businesses are being judged. So if that's why, let's go back to how. How do we promote those enterprises and business models that are more climate and nature friendly and shift the economic narrative away from one that looks at a narrow definition of efficiency, one that is both inefficient on levels around waste and deficient in the true breadth of its externalities? To quote Patrick Holden, we should question why we pay for produce at least 3 times over, whether that's taxpayer subsidies for farming, whether that's paying at tills, paying at the tables, and also paying in terms of bills. So water bills, which might cover water treatment, flood management from poor agricultural practices, or taxpayers picking up the other environmental or health costs, such as the cost to the NHS of diet-related disease. I think this is a theme running in the chat box. This true cost accounting would rebalance the arguments for systems that are more sustainable. And this is very topical with the Das Gupta report coming out today, which kind of, I suppose, brings a new angle to that. But I want to argue for another angle that is perhaps more persuasive in the current climate. And maybe just coming back to Ellis's point, how can we speak to different communities? How can we sort of sell this in a different way? So the answer would be jobs, more jobs, better jobs. Without meaning to sound like a politician. I've lost track on whether we're heading for a double dip recession or triple dip recession. Either way, it's looking as bumpy as a Big Dipper. And alongside it, we're going to be facing incredibly high unemployment rates. So the sustainable food sector, the good food movement, whatever term you identify with, we need to articulate where we can the case for those innovations, enterprises and sectors that provide more employment. So where can we make this case? Here's a list of a few different areas that we feature in the report. I'll put a link to that in the chat box at the end of this. And also we featured in our annual conference before Christmas. But just to pick out a few, because I don't have time to go through all of these. So organic farming. Organic farming has 32% more jobs per farm than equivalent non-organic farms. Various studies show. So whilst this is an unlikely scenario that all our farming is going to go organic, which would produce 93,000 more on-farm jobs, some research says. But a modest target of 10 to 15% of farms and farmland going organic in the UK could lead to an extra 10,000 jobs. Or whether you look at something like local food infrastructure and investing in that, investing in abattoirs, in markets, things like community food hubs. So this is an area where another Sustain member, the Open Food Network, has estimated that those community food hubs estimate or employ an estimated 3 times more jobs per pound spent, or looking at like something like real bread baking. So if all bread at current sales was bought from real bread bakeries, independent bakeries, it would employ an extra 75,000 people. Some of this could be achieved if government banned misleading labelling of bread, which means that supermarkets can produce knockoff products and shift that demand to smaller bakeries. Or finally, looking at something like EcoFeed. This is a proposal from the charity Feedback. So feeding safe leftovers to pigs, reducing that reliance on imported animal feed. So things like soy produced in deforested lands. If 20% of UK food waste went into pig feed, this could lead to over 1,000 new jobs in new treatment facilities alongside increased viabilities for small and medium farms. You get the point. There are sectors out there, there are innovations, there are enterprises that are inherently more sustainable, and we need to be focusing on those alternatives and making sure the investment and the policies support those rather than sort of the more destructive mainstream varieties. You know, I'm sort of making it sort of seem cut and dry and black and white, and obviously it's not quite as clear as that. I
Ben,
think the crucial thing, I'll finish up. So the crucial thing about all of these areas is that they're not just providing more jobs than the currently mainstream alternatives. They do so alongside climate benefits and other environmental and social and health benefits. So I'll finish up by saying, you know, we really want to be working with those people who can make a case for job benefits alongside those other benefits, and to explore what investment and policies are needed, how we can translate that growth in terms of jobs per constituency to try and convince MPs and policymakers that these are the ideas we should be going towards. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so much to delve into there from what everyone has said. I mean, my head personally is exploding with questions, so no doubt yours are. And I can see the Q&A box is popping up. So before we move to that, I just thought we'd have kind of a few minutes for panelists to reflect on what each other have said, if you'd like. So you can just jump in if you've got any reflections or want to discuss. And if there's silence, obviously we'll just move on to the Q&A. Okay.
I had a quick reflection on Tom's values framing and common cause. And I suppose on the surface, it might seem like what I was sort of talking about was advocating for maybe contradictory things. You know, I'm sort of talking about an economic focus when I think with common cause, it's just saying, let's move away from that more self-orientated sort of personal economic benefits to focus to things that have, I suppose, more universal appeal. And I suppose the question is really about audience. You know, where the audience is policymakers, maybe my argument is that there's a weak spot around that economic argument, which needs better articulating, not instead of, but alongside some of those other impacts. But I think the values framework still comes into play, and it'd be really great if maybe I'll post this in the chat box for those of you who aren't familiar with the Common Cause values wheel. But I think part of this is about saying how are you framing your arguments in a way that not only appeal to different groups, but also try to pivot people from one. Sorry, I've got a very loud cat here, a very angry cat. How do you pivot people away from those more selfish arguments to more sort of universal arguments, and where are those things that you can enter into? So it might be that stressing the patriotism, the security, you know, British jobs, or a sort of benevolence argument, the jobs for your children, the jobs for your children's, you know, your children's future, rather than necessarily triggering more selfish motivations, might be a way in which we can sort of push that line of argument at least.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ben. Tom, do you want to come back on that at all?
I think we should move on to others, Cecily. There's lots I could say, but I don't think.
Okay, in that case, let's move straight on to the Q&A because we've got a whole bunch of questions. So I think the one that has been voted up most is from Carol, and I think this one is aimed towards Ellis, but please do all answer it, panelists. So it's, tell us what is cool for young people, as I'm trying to target young people, but I'm a middle-aged woman. Thanks very much, Carol. So Ellis, that one's for you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. What is cool for young people? Well, I mean, I don't want to sound like the authorial voice on young people. And actually, I'm not, obviously I'm not, but what will you get a young person on your team, whatever you are trying to do form-wise in terms of your protests, in terms of your revolution, in terms of, you know, your campaign, whatever it is, get a young person, you know, involved. Actively look for someone in your community who is young and who you're trying to target, and just ask them. You know, there'll be different wants and needs and feelings in lots of different ways. And also, as dreaded as it probably is for lots of people, it's dreadful for me to go on. I mean, I already feel like I'm a generation above TikTok, but go to where young people are, you know, and look at what is trending, look at what is working for them. young people are not, although they're often presented as this really bizarre and scary race, almost alien-like, that sit all the time with their iPhones as some sort of like third hand. They're just normal human beings. Ask them. In the same way that I asked my mum, you know, does this make sense to you, this Guardian piece? And she said no. And I had to think about, okay, how else can I speak to her? Well, the analogy of menopause worked, you know. And now I don't know whether my mum is the authorial voice on middle-aged women, probably not. But just going and speaking to a young person, I honestly think it's that simple. Can I push back on something that Carol said in the dismissed section? Do you mind?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
Thank you so much for your comments in the dismissed section, Carol. I would like to say, yes, I totally agree that we should be focusing on subsidies for dairy, milk and cheap meat, those types of things. And if you're campaigning on that, that's really, really cool, and I totally support you. I would like to push back on when you say, also, if we reduce our meat intake, then we can afford good free-range organic meat once a week. That is, I don't agree with that. I think it's so difficult for a person to find those type of things. It's much more complex than that. You are asking a generation of people who have not had access to recipes, all these sorts of things, to suddenly be able to cook lots of different meals. You know, as we know from this pandemic, working class people and people on the breadline are much more likely to be key workers. My mum is a nurse, you know, and she also has another job. So asking my mum who runs and does 2 different jobs, to then start buying a cookbook and looking for ways for her to incorporate like more vegan or more plant-based meals is just simply unrealistic. And I think it's a lot more so I think it's a lot more complex than that. But I would say to you, go ahead and fight against why processed meats and milk is subsidized. I think that's a lot more interesting and will be a lot more effective. Thanks, Carol.
I like to come in on young people. I think that we must be playful and serious at the same time. You know, we get far too serious, but not playful. And this is where artists come in. You know, I mean, the way I'm answering the next question on artists and linking it together. For young people, we need to do things that are surprising and impactful and allow them to actually participate. So I'm going to do this now. This is a monkey mask made by my Mexican artist friend in Mexico. And his idea is that we can train hundreds of young people wearing monkey masks or any other animal to go into parks and supermarkets and so on in a surprising way, walking around. But these young people will be informed by organizations like Sustain with the most up-to-date climate change information and link it right in the center of people's lives, like the fact that at the moment, Brazilian forests are being burnt down to grow soya so that we can have cheap chicken. You know, so that everyday life, what we do, buying things like chicken and so on, is suddenly transported to fun images, serious stories and so on, and then action to promote change. So I think these things, combining things on all those fronts, are really important. And making things together is another thing that is very beautiful. You know, you can sit in the open air, in green spaces and so on, and make things slowly for hours. And Ned James, in a question, talked about what about craftivism, she says, where you actually have time to communicate because you're making something. Again, you can teach young people how to make masks, paint them beautifully, think of which are the endangered animals, what their homes are like, build up the stories to talk about habitats as the homes of animals and what's happening to them, and then linking it into all the things that climate change is making impossible for biodiversity, for food growing and so on.
Thanks, Judy. Anyone else like to come in on that? Should we move to another question? I'm seeing shaking heads from the panelists. So we'll go to the next question, which was, how can we get the message across that more processed food, even if it's plant-based, is simply another totem for food business billionaires? And that's from Stephen Jacobs. Any thoughts? That one's probably one for you, Ben, maybe?
Yeah, I'm still thinking through my sort of response to that. But I think the first level, I'd actually come back to Ellis's point here. I mean, you sort of, Alice, you inadvertently paraphrased my sort of mantra about making good food more affordable, more accessible, and more desirable. I think this is the heart of it, and ultimately more desirable than those unhealthy and unsustainable foods. And if you look across the variety of different policies that Sustain is pushing, and I appreciate we're talking at a policy level, that's one of the ways in which we work. But whether you look at things like the sugary drinks tax, the money raised from that was all about trying to get those unhealthier versions more expensive than the healthier versions, and equally to take the money from that and put it into subsidizing the good stuff. So putting it into subsidizing food education in schools, cooking equipment, or we would argue you can think bigger, you can think more about how you can rebalance the system so that it is so that it's those good alternatives are cheaper, but equally they're subsidized, particularly for lower income communities. So paying for things like free school meals and expanding that, things like Healthy Start vouchers. I think we need to be much more ambitious. The government needs to be much more ambitious in the way that it thinks about rebalancing this, because we have a food system that is completely unbalanced, and the government that is historically has been unwilling to intervene. But it really does need to intervene if we're going to make sure that we not only tackle the climate emergency, but also make sure that everybody has that right to food. I could go on, but I want to hear what other panelists have to say.
Thanks, Ben. Would anyone else like to come in on that? Ellis, you're muted if you were talking.
I wasn't, sorry, I was reading one of the comments in the chat. I don't think I've got any further to add. I didn't think I agree with Ben.
Okay, no worries.
I suppose one other point on that. So we just thinking about the accessibility point of view. Convenience really is king. People are fickle beasts. We funded some work when we did a pilot of the sugary drinks tax, and we funded some work up in Newcastle, Eagles Community Solutions, I think it was. And it was a basketball club, and the kids there would just buy soft drinks from the cafe, and the funding installed some drinking fountains. Then they just all shifted to using the drinking fountains because it was closer, it was more convenient, and it was cheaper as well. So there are those solutions out there that can sort of shift us away from sort of more processed alternatives. We just need to make sure that it's easier to get. I can walk down my high street and walk past 10 chicken shops before I reach something that might sell something that is healthier. And as Alice was saying, invariably it's more expensive. So we do need to kind of we really need to sort of push everything we can to kind of rebalance things.
I think that the experience of eating fresh food is basically fundamental. Our generation at the moment, we're very aware that so many people no longer know how to cook, so that their children never experience freshness. And that's why the allotments and food growing movement is very much part of this. If you experience it, you really want it, because there's nothing like really, really fresh food that you have grown yourself from your allotment. So, okay, you'll never grow everything you need because there's just not enough land, especially in urban areas. But what you grow changes your view about food and what you want the people who grow your food, the amount that you actually cannot grow. And I have seen projects in the cities and so on, where very aware community groups have linked food growing also to sharing cooking. So they come together and cook together, and people experience the diversity of food recipes and so on, are really inspired to want more that is fresh. So this accessibility to fresh food is really important as a fundamental for people wanting a change in how we buy food and what is available.
Thanks very much, Judy. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know, as Ben's pointed out, Sustain couldn't agree more. We got a very popular question from Josh, which is a question for Tom and others. So he said that Tom said, most of us care more for one another than expected. This feels a bit deglobalized. Do Westerners care for global South populations? In capitalist society, can we presume good faith even with minority communities, the global South and the global North? If the answers are no, my question is, how do we meet the media political discourse on responsibility and appropriate climate action where it is? And how do we actually undermine the rupture of care where, and how can comms go further? So that's quite a big question. Tom, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Yeah, and I wasn't. I mean, it is the research suggests, not just ours, but now others suggests that whilst we do care deeply about one another in the broader sense, not just our immediate communities, those people we see as being part of our in-group, but also people more widely, that we tend to underestimate that care in others. But that's not to suggest some kind of I'm not trying to airbrush away the fact that we're a whole medley of different, a melange of different values and motivations, aren't we? There's self-interest and loyalty to our own particular in-group in us all as well. What I think the research suggests is that at the moment our perception of the concern most of us can manifestly feel for others, including others in outgroups for far side of the world, people who we don't see as being similar to us, that concern is underestimated. And I think you're right to suggest that a probable reason for that seemingly systemic underappreciation of the concern that we're capable of do feel for one another is because of a dominant political discourse, dominant debate in the media, which tends to foreground division, tends to foreground self-interest. And you can imagine this becoming a kind of a self-perpetuating vicious circle, where because we consume media and political discourse that reminds us that we're inherently selfish and different from others, that tends perhaps to hold us back from expressing those more communitarian or empathetic values, which means we're not testifying to the importance we place on those values. And so we're therefore potentially contributing to the problem of others underestimating the importance of those values. That vicious circle could equally be reversed, and that was what we were trying to do in projects like the one I mentioned in the museum, of simply bringing people together, of taking away the politicians, of taking away the media, and bringing people together across points of difference and facilitating them in exploring with one another what they care about in life. And people reported overwhelmingly that it was a really positive experience to talk to people they wouldn't normally stop and talk to, not about the bus timetable or the weather, but about what really mattered to them.
Ellis, yeah, 1 minute, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up.
Oh, I don't think my thought is interesting enough to end the webinar. But if I'm honest, I'm still cogitating this and still trying to develop an answer on your question, Josh. It's huge and also very interesting. But I would like to go back to my point earlier about comms around people from in the global south. You know, about what we usually have is a political narrative which treats people who are minorities as victims in all of these types of things. So and it makes us much easier, therefore, to scroll past them because it is the same old. So how do you? We are right now of a generation where we know everything. So how can we care about everything? It's so difficult. You know, we're crying about nuclear war or Brexit or trans people being murdered. You know, there's a lot to consume. So I think in terms of how communication can go further, it's about actually empowering people in the global south, making their stories accessible and giving them autonomy. And I think that's how we make us care much more. Please read if you haven't, I'm sure you have, you're probably vastly more experienced on this whole situation than I am. But I think the Eve Tuck thing about letters to our communities is a very, very interesting way of making us care about the struggles of communities that aren't exactly from our own lived experience. And I think that type of framing in terms of political narrative and communication is interesting, and the data shows it's also highly effective.
I think that the people we call ethnic minorities, as I said, they are the ambassadors for the world. They're in touch with all these experiences across the world. So if we make links with them, we hear these stories directly with all the emotion that they feel and will inspire us to connect with and do something right across the world in terms of climate change.
And I think that's an excellent way to finish. Thank you so much, all. Before we wrap up, I'm aware that we're just running a little over time, my bad as chair, but I just want to launch the other poll just to see how, if this has been a useful session for you, basically. So please, again, go to the poll section and do fill that in. Will just help us get a better idea of whether this has been useful, and I'm sure the panelists will all appreciate it as well. So thank you for that. And this has been an incredible conversation, and I daren't even attempt to summarise, and I certainly don't have time to summarise. But so many important points have been raised that I think we're all able to go away and take to our organisations, into our own personal lives, and think about how we can better communicate this important issue so we can actually achieve change, because we need to achieve change. If you'd like to continue the conversations, I am organising a virtual networking event to hear from local projects that are working on tackling climate change and building a better food system. So if you'd like to hear more about that event, then please contact Sustain and we can keep you updated as plans progress. But finally, we're 2 minutes over, so just a huge thank you to all of the panelists. You've all been amazing, superb, and given us so much to think about. Thank you also to everyone for joining and participating in this session. We will share the recording and all of the links shared in the chat with you later this week. But for now, have a great day all. Goodbye.
Thanks, Cecily. Can you leave the webinar open for a minute? Because I'm still going through the comments. I want to answer a few more.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, and that's a good shout, actually. We didn't get to answer nearly as many questions as we had posed. So we'll stay here and we'll just kind of respond to those just for 5-10 minutes. Thanks all.
Someone's asking me, I'm going to put the Eve Talk letter to communities link in now.
Gotcha.
You're still here.